Hey everyone, so in this video, I'm going to show you how to build an AI sales agent. This agent can call leads who've signed up through a form, qualify those leads using some screening questions, book a follow-up call live on the call, update your CRM, and send a personalized follow-up. I'll show you how I built all of this using a voice AI tool called Vapi and a workflow automation tool called n8n. In this video, I'll give you a demo and a step-by-step walkthrough of the solution. But before we jump into it, my name is Liam and I run AI Operators. We use no-code and AI tools to put your operations on autopilot. If you're an individual or a business looking for help to build these types of solutions, you can book a call below. But without further ado, let's jump into the demo. So this is our sales form and I'm gonna fill it out. Okay, I want to scale my pet grooming business without having to hire staff. I'm going to give some information about myself. Obviously, I'm going to blur out the actual personal information. Cool. So I'm going to submit this and we should get a call. Here we go. So I've got my call. Answer.
Hi, am I speaking with Liam?
Yep, this is Liam.
Great. I saw you signed up for our AI automation masterclass. Are you still interested in participating?
Yeah, I am.
You mentioned that you want to scale your pet grooming business without having to hire staff. Does that sound about right?
Yep.
Great. I will need to ask you some qualifying questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfectly fine.
The masterclass involves a 2-day in-person retreat. Are you available to travel sometime in the first half of January?
Of course.
That's great. The masterclass starts at $8,000 USD. Does that work for you?
Yes.
Great. The next step is the screening interview. One moment, and I'll find the soonest availability for you. Hold on a sec. The soonest available slot for the screening interview is on January 6th, 2025 at 9 a.m. Does this time work for you?
Yeah, 9 a.m. works great.
Give me a moment. Great. You should have a confirmation in your inbox.
Great, thanks so much.
Goodbye.
All right, so a little bit abrupt on the sign off there, but let's check in my inbox and I should have a couple confirmations here. So I've got the actual meeting that got booked in my calendar, which is great. And I have a personalized message. Excited for the AI automation masterclass as our subject. Hey Liam, it was fantastic to chat with you today about your interest in the AI automation masterclass. We're thrilled to see you scheduled for a screening interview on January 6th at 9 a.m. Looking forward to welcoming you to the retreat in January. It's going to be an amazing experience. Thanks again for your enthusiasm. Signing off as AI team, which is interesting. And again, I think we could probably adjust the prompt a little bit to get some more personalization out of that. But it's been able to pick up like the booking time and then some details about the program itself. So this is looking great. Okay, so let's get into actually looking at how to set this up. And we're going to start here. This is another diagram really just showing and explaining the flow of data. So the key two players here are n8n, where we're doing all of the different workflows. We're hitting some APIs to find out some information. And then Vapi, where we've set up, or we're going to set up an assistant that will be able to talk with people on the phone. So how it works, we have an input. That input is our form that's getting sent to n8n. n8n is then going to call the Vapi API to start a call. Now Vapi is going to be engaged in a call with a user, and they're going to go back and forth with messages. Meanwhile, Vapi, when they get to this stage, it's going to make some calls back to n8n to get some information, and it's going to do that using tools. We have a couple tools: get availability, like find out what slots we have available, and then book that slot. So as Vapi is having this conversation, it's sending requests back to n8n. n8n is then responding to Vapi. So like when you ask for slots, it's going to give some slots. It's going to present that to the user, do the same thing when it books the slot. So n8n will respond and say, hey, that's been a success. And then the call is going to end. Vapi will send information back to n8n, and then n8n is going to output into our CRM and send some emails. So let's jump into it and take a look at what this looks like. We're going to start in n8n itself. And just to walk through all of this high level. We have our basically start a call workflow. So from that form, start a call. We have the two tools, and these are in separate workflows in the same section. We'll get into how these work. And then we have our end of call report. So like when the call ends, do some actions. So starting here, this all starts in Tally. So we've set up a webhook. So in n8n, you have the webhook node, which we've already got set up here. So we can check that out. We've got some data pinned that we can take a look at and sort of play around with. This is a really great way to test. Instead of having to always trigger, you can actually just put test data in here and use it to use in your following actions. So to show you the setup in Tally really quickly, we've got a webhook set up here. We're putting that webhook URL into the endpoint, and whenever we get a form submission, we're then going to trigger this flow. So if we jump over to our next step, we have an Airtable step. This is built in as a node in n8n, so that's great. You can choose whatever operation you want. We have an upsert or a create or update, and we're just matching to see, hey, is there already a user with this email address, and then adding some information that we want to save, and that's just coming from the Tally form directly. Just to show you a little bit about how you can map these variables in n8n, you can do it with expressions. So you can either, you can use the curly bracket and then $ to find what you want to pull out, and you can also use functions and things like that. Or you can do it in a more tactile way, which is just dragging these into the columns. I find that super effective, really easy, and fairly quick, but you can do it either way. So we've got this information. Let's actually just run this. Great. So I think there's probably already a record there. It's found it and pulled up some of the information. So obviously this has already happened. We've got a transcript, but in normal cases, we wouldn't have that information. So the next step is to actually reach out to Vapi. So n8n doesn't have a native connector for Vapi. However, you can use their API to trigger basically everything that you can do in their system. So here we are using a post request to start a call. The key thing in Vapi about their API that may not be obvious when you're setting this up is that they have what is called JWT authentication. They've got all this documentation about how it works. I'm not going to go too deeply into it, but basically what it's doing is it's taking two keys and then making a unique token based on those two keys. So luckily in n8n, there is a JWT step. You don't have to create any sort of account for JWT. You just need to input information. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So I already have my credentials here. I'm going to open it up. Type is PEM or PEM. And then what we're going to do is add our private key and our public key. These both come from Vapi. So if we go to API keys, you'll see here that you've got a private key and then there's a public key. You can create, one or more private and public keys, but you just need a combination of one private key and a public key. You put them in these steps, set the algorithm to HS256, and then you're all set. Here you do have to have a specific payload that you actually send off to generate the token. So here we have an org ID, and this is, again, all in the documentation for Vapi. And then you have an expiry. This is really just setting an expiry an hour from whenever we call this. And this is just a function that's doing that. Don't worry too much about that. That's in the template. You can really just copy and paste it. Most important thing here is getting that org ID. So you're going to find that in settings. You'll be able to see your org ID there. So let's test this, see if we can get our token, which we did. That's great. And this is going to actually expire in an hour. It does make it more secure in that way. So nobody can just take this token and keep using it. Like the people watching this video, it will expire. So we've got our token. Now we need to actually call Vapi to say, hey, start this call. Whenever I'm connecting with an API, whenever there's not a native node in n8n, what you need to do is use the HTTP request node. And I think the easiest way to set these up is to actually import as a curl. So I'll show you how to do that. In our example, we're using the Vapi API. So we've got their API reference. What we want to do is create the call. Typically in a good documentation, they'll kind of explain what all these calls do, but this is the one that's relevant to us. And what you'll notice here, this is just describing all of the fields you need, whether they're required, whether they're optional. And what's really helpful here is that you can hit this play button. So the play button will allow you to input the variables, and then you can take that whole request, copy it, and then import as a curl. When you copy it in here, n8n is just going to take all that information and put it in all the right spots. So you're going to put your body where it needs to be, the authorization. Here we need to put in a variable. So we're actually taking this token and we're putting it in there. But for all the other things, we're going to get a base kind of schema and it's all going to fill where we want it to. So this is often a good approach to get those structured so you've got stuff in the right place. And you can just put dummy data in there and then fill it in once you've copied it into n8n. So if we jump back, and then we have the variable values. So these are really important and they're going to come up when we're creating our prompt. But these are things that we can inject into our prompt. So if we jump into our assistant, you'll see that we've got a first name. We have now, which that's just actually a system variable. So that's just coming from Vapi itself. We have a goal, and then we have some kind of like administrative information, the record ID and the email. To set up these variables, you really just need to put them in your prompt. You don't have to set them up in any settings. You can, create whatever variable you need. It just needs to be between these curly brackets. And then once you've done that, you can reference those in your actual call. So here I've got my first name, goal, record ID, and email. As long as these match the variables that you have in your prompt, it's going to insert that information and give it to the assistant so that it knows. So, this is some relevant information that our assistant needs to know. But yeah, so this is actually ready to go. We could test this and it's actually going to call my number. I'm not going to do that, but we're going to jump into Vapi and take a look at the prompt and some of the settings that we have on our assistant. So here you can create an assistant, you can name it whatever you want. You can do a blank template. They also have these quick start templates that you can use. I think those are useful just to kind of learn how to structure these prompts. They also have some guidance in their documentation about how to structure prompts, but we'll go through the existing one that I already have. So we have a first message. That's just the first thing that you want the assistant to say to the person. So how you want to address them. We're just saying, hi, I'm speaking with first name, and that's information we're passing in our request. And then we have our actual prompt. So we have a few different sections here, and I'll go through those. We've got a role. So you're a lead qualification expert, an AI assistant designed to qualify leads for the masterclass. Your primary task is to ask questions, gather relevant information, and either schedule an appointment or provide additional resource based on the lead's responses. So again, this is kind of some of the key work in creating these assistants is really dialing in these prompts. There is a lot of guidance just on the internet in general. You can obviously copy this prompt, and then Vapi, their documentation tells you how to do these prompts as well. What's really important is that we're giving enough information and not too much information so that the assistant understands what to do. So we've given it a role. We have some context. So like you're interacting with leads to qualify them for a 2-month small group cohort masterclass, culminating in a two-day intensive retreat to a secret location. And we're now giving some information about how to qualify them. So we've got this $8,000 fee. And only use information from the context, don't invent additional details. This is something that you'll battle against where your assistant will just, if you haven't told it otherwise, it will just want to kind of free associate and start saying things. We have our system value so that our assistant knows what time it is. That's relevant in booking the slots. And then for response handling here, when asking questions, evaluate the lead's response to ensure it is relevant and valid. If the response qualifies as valid, proceed to the next steps. If a clear answer isn't provided, ask clarifying questions to move the conversation forward. So again, just putting guardrails so that that assistant knows what to do. We got a warning here, do not modify or correct the user input. So we want to get exactly what that user is saying and not have the assistant just make stuff up. We have guidelines around how they respond to the user. This is really important so that it doesn't sound weird. And here we just want it to be concise and professional. And often the problem is that they just talk too much. Calm, professional tone. Always answer the lead's question directly without adding in unnecessary information. We've kind of talked about that. Dates are kind of awkward, so giving some information about how to say dates, and then avoid filler words like. And there are actually some hard-coded settings that you can set on your assistant to determine whether they use like or, but I just like to put it in the prompt anyway. So we've got our conversation flow. This is pretty important. This really gives us the structure of the conversation. So like question by question, and then telling the assistant what to do in what case. And it's really just like proceed to next step. And if no, do something else. What I find really useful is to have this ask and then in quotes, put the information. So your assistant will actually pretty reliably say exactly what you have in quotes. And especially if you want something very consistent, this is a good way to kind of mitigate against that free association. And then obviously we have temperature as well, which just determines how much randomness the assistant puts into its responses. So we have some notes here around like using tools. So, get the soonest available slots. Here I'm actually mentioning like use book slot tool, which I think helps. Generally it's smart enough to do that, but I just put it in case. And then we have a few things at the end, just call closing, which I think like we could definitely work on. It was a bit abrupt. And then the free offer. So if they don't qualify, tell them that, they can get this free guide. At the bottom here, I'm passing some admin data that actually the assistant doesn't need to use. I just want to get that on the other side when I receive the request. So I've got that Airtable record ID and then their email address. This seems to have worked pretty reliably. I think I wish there was a way in Vapi to just kind of put that information in the background and then catch it on the other side. But this has worked. But yeah, if anybody has some suggestions on that, I'd love to hear it in the comments. We'll skip over transcriber. I haven't really done any changes to that. In voice, there's a number of different providers and then voices that come along with those providers. The main setting that I've played around with here, and I've already mentioned, is filler injection enabled. This means that the assistant will say things like. So when they're talking, they'll just inject things, filler words like, and then back channeling is using like that. I find that these actually just distract from what the assistant is trying to do, and they don't reliably sound natural. Sometimes the ums are just in really strange, unnatural places, and it really just takes away from what the assistant is trying to accomplish. So I've got those turned off, but you can experiment with them. So now we're going to go into functions, and this is really looking at the tools that the assistant can use. And if we jump back to our diagram, this is really this loop that the assistant is doing of calling a tool, getting a response from n8n, calling another tool, getting a response, etc., and feeding that information back to the user. So if we jump into Vapi, we can see we have the get availability and the book slot tool. You can just select which ones you want to apply, and you can just create these broad-based tools that you can turn on for any set of assistants. So let's get into actually creating a tool. There is a tool section where you can create it, or you can create a new tool here. So I'm going to click create new tool. We'll look at some of the options when you're creating a new tool. So we've got a custom tool, make, or go high level. We're using n8n, so we have to use a custom tool. But if you're using something like make, you can actually, I think they have a Vapi connector that you can use, and you can connect directly, and then you have go high level as well. But we're going to use the custom option. I find this is the best option in any case, even if you're using something like make, just for flexibility. And we'll get into what that looks like. So for here, we're going to jump back into n8n and take a look at the tools that we've got. So we've got two tools, and they're in two different workflows. Well, they're in one workflow, but they've got two different endpoints. You could, in theory, put these into one endpoint and then use some logic to decide where to go to get the information. I've just separated them out because I think it makes it a bit clearer. So we've got our availability tool, and you'll notice that this is very similar to what we're using when we catch the information from the form. We're using a webhook. So these all come with a URL. And what we're doing here is on the server URL, we're just adding that webhook address. So we'd put that in there, And then now the tool knows where to go to send the request. There's other information and options you can put in here. I'm going to leave those blank, but we can save that and then hit next. So here's where we build our schema. And this is just telling the LLM what type of data to generate. So in our case, where we're doing available slots, we want a property called available slots. And it's always important to explain what this property is. So these are the times retrieved from the calendar. And you can play around with these descriptions, but basic idea here, you want the assistant in the LLM to understand where to put the data. And you're actually going to see that in our response too. So we're going to go next. And then here we have, there's what is this tool for? So describing further, what is this tool? And this is, I think, pretty important so that the assistant knows when to call the tool. In theory, you don't have to fill this out, but this is just going to improve accuracy. So here we could go get, and then we can put a description, call this tool to get available slots in calendar. So lastly here we have some stock messages that our assistant will say either when they're initiating the tool or when they've gotten a response. So you can have a start message. So here you might want to say like, let me take a look at the calendar and see what availabilities we have for you. You know, if there's a delay in that, you can have a message. And then there's the success and the error message. So like, hey, we got some slots, or no, we're having some issues. And you can put these messages in and the assistant will say that exactly. Again, these are optional. You don't have to do it, but I find they're helpful. So let's go into the actual configuration of these tools in n8n itself. We've kind of looked at how to build the tool in Vapi, but then how do we connect it up to n8n? So we've got one that's set up here, get availability. So let's jump into that one. So that's the availability tool call. And just as a high level, we're receiving that request from Vapi. We're then calling an API, which is cal.com, to get available slots. We're doing some data transformation, more data transformation, a model, and then we're sending that information back to Vapi. So if we take a look here, I've got some data that's already pinned. Again, this is, I find, such a useful feature when you're testing. And generally what I do is I'll set these tools up. I'll have a kind of a test conversation and ensure that the assistant calls that tool. When they call that tool, you get a record of all of that in the webhooks section, and you can see the type of webhook, so we can see these tool calls. And when you click in, you can actually get the whole body of the request. So like we can see here all the different things that we sent, like the email, the first name, the slot to be booked, January 6, 2025. And if we go back to the tool, just to show you that, sorry, that's the book slot tool. These are all kind of the properties that come along with that. And you can see it in the request. You can even take that information and then copy it in as data that you can use as test data and just use that as your test bed as you're building out. So here we want to set, it's important to set this as using respond to webhook because we need to actually respond back to Vapi, and we'll get to that second half a little later, but important to put that in. I'm going to set this to a post request. So all webhook calls that Vapi is going to make are posts. And I think by default, it might be get. From there, we're going to set up our get availability call. Again, this is a standard API call. I'm not going to go into great detail. This is one feature I just really like about Cal. You can actually create a booking using Cal, and getting available slots is pretty easy. But there's other alternatives here. You could use Google Calendar and get slots through the calendar, but just important to kind of control all the variables there. As I've said, best way to do this, just fill in the variables and then copy the request and then import it. Great. So again, we go through, we do some data transformation, then we're putting it into messaging the model to do some time conversion here and telling the model like how we want that to come out. And then here, really important is the structure of the response. So this is the response here. You can get this from the Vapi documentation. I feel like I'm really just repeating myself on that, but this is really crucial. So we need the tool call ID. That is a unique ID that every time the assistant calls a tool. So every time you call a tool, you're going to get this unique ID, and that needs to be in the response so that Vapi knows like where that came from. And then the second piece is the actual result. So whatever it is that, you know, this workflow is doing, in this case, we're just sending kind of in human readable text the slots that are available. We want to put that in the result field. So our second tool, the book slot tool, we took a look at it here. We've got the setup, some of the details about it, all of the different properties. These are really important in this case because in this one, the assistant is sending information back to this flow. We're sending the email, the first name, and the slot to be booked because we need all that information to actually book the call. So if we jump in here, we can look at that info. We should be able to see it. So here we have our slot to be booked. So this person has select January 6th, 11:30. All this stuff is the same. We need to respond to the webhook, make sure it's a post. We're taking that information, throwing it into a model to convert it and put it in a specific format. And these are pretty reliable. If you give an example, I'm also outputting as JSON, which makes it quite reliable in its output. And then we create that booking. Again, this is just an API request to cal.com's API, and it's a post request. Same advice there. Go to their documentation, copy the curl, and then just import it. There's a few pieces of information here we need to paste in from the previous step. So like we said, the first name, the email, and then also the start of the slot, which we've kind of put through a model to get a response that we can actually put into the request. We need to identify the event type ID. And again, this is just really applies to if you're using Cal according to their API. From there, we're going to structure the response. So same as the availability tool, it needs to be structured in that specific way where you have that unique tool call ID and the result. We're doing it in slightly a different way. So I'm using the set node. So if we go here, set node, this is just a way to modify or kind of put an output in a particular structure. So we're doing that in the set node, and then in the response, we're just saying first incoming item, take that information and send it. This is just another approach, not necessarily better than the other, but just so you know some of the different options here, we've actually done that JSON in the response itself. So that covers the tools portion of it. And now we can jump back into Vapi and look at what happens at the end of a call. So here we need to jump into the advanced section. I'm not going to cover this stuff, but what's really relevant to us is the server URL. So this is going to determine where we're sending the information after the call ends. So this works a lot like the tools do, except it's just set up in a different place. So here we have server URL and we have server messages. We also have client messages. We're not going to worry about those. But for the server messages, we're just going to set it to the end of call report. There's other information we can put in here if we want it, but I'm just interested in getting the end of call report. I've just checked that. And then I'm putting the URL of the endpoint where I want to send that information. And like we've seen, that is a separate endpoint. So we have this end of call report right here. So I'm just taking that URL, putting it in as the server URL and sending it to the end of call report. Lastly, what's really important for that end of call report is the analysis section. So this is a way that you can extract certain data points from the conversation after it's happened. So here we want to qualify the lead. So I've set up a prompt and some structured output so that we can get that data and then use it in our end of call workflow. So here I'm just saying, please tell me whether the lead qualified for the masterclass. If they qualify, write a brief summary of anything you learned personally about the user, business goals, etc. And we're going to use that information when we create our personalized email. And then below, to make this even more bulletproof, we have structured data that we then can output into that response. So we have a qualified field, which is a Boolean, so true or false. We have a description for that. which just adds more color to this, whether the lead qualifies for the masterclass. And we have a user learning field, which is really that second part. That's just a string. And again, we have a description for that field. And all this description is just so that the LLM understands what it needs to output. So now we have a structure of the actual analysis that we've done on the call. You could do this in n8n, but I like to have this set up in Vapi so it all gets sent to n8n, and then we don't have to bother with other steps to throw that into a model to do analysis. So really great feature. You can also make these required if they need to be. So if we jump in here, jump into our end of call report, we should be able to find that structured data. So here we can see that, in this case, they qualified. We have the user learning, which is just this quick summary. We also have a summary. I mean, in this case, like the summary really does what this user learning does, but there's likely going to be things you're going to want to pull out of the call, either for analysis, maybe things you want to put into your CRM so that you can more easily analyze calls on a kind of on an aggregate level. So again, same thing. We've got some data pinned. That is a webhook. Again, we don't need to respond back. These are sort of the final actions that are happening. So there's a couple things we're doing. We're checking to see whether the call was a success. So there's a field called success evaluation. And that's just going to tell you, like, did they get through the conversation, or did somebody hang up, or did they not even answer the call? So this is really important because we don't want to do those other steps if like they haven't even picked up the phone. And there could be things that we want to do if they don't pick up the phone. Like maybe we want to track that, hey, we called them 5 times, and after 5 times, we don't want to call them anymore. So from there, we jump into the qualified steps. So this is just looking at that structured data that we talked about and checking to see whether it's true. So if it is true, we're going to update that record in the CRM, and we're going to add the transcript, the call summary, and we're going to also add that qualified step. So if we jump into Airtable, we can see here we've got that qualified field, call summary, the actual transcripts, and all the information we need. There's probably tons of other information we can add here. And in fact, just to take a look at some of what you can put in here. So if we go back to the actual response, it's really, I think, a good exercise to actually see what gets output here. So every individual message gets output. We get some information about the tool calls, the duration of each message. It really gets pretty fine-grained. We get our transcript, of course, a recording URL. So this is the actual audio file if you have audio turned on, where you can jump in and listen to that recording. We could put that into our Airtable base if we want. Cost breakdown. This is super important to have if you're doing work for a client and you need to optimize the assistant to make sure that it's not burning too much money. Yeah, so just so many options here of things that you can pull in: full duration, full cost, lots of stuff. So make sure you look through this, see what you need to pull into a CRM, and that information is really important if you want to analyze these calls that you're having with users. So jumping back to it, we're going to update that record. And then here we're going to write our personalized email. So we're pulling some information. So we're using the summary. We did have that user learning field. Again, the summary really does what we want it to do. And then we've got some details here, like don't make mention of the price or their commitment to pay it in the actual personalized email. So when I first created this, I was seeing that the AI would say like, thank you for paying, saying that you're going to pay $8,000. Like, just not something you'd likely want to put in a response. So that's where you really need to dial these prompts in and make sure that it's outputting what you want and reliably doing that. So we've got an example here that it can kind of glean from. But this is going to give us our personalized email, and then it's a basic Gmail step. These are built into n8n, so you can just use that Gmail node, put in the email address, put in the subject, which is also generated by the AI, and then the message, and you're all set on that front. On the false side, we just get that original record and the details about it, and then we just send them an email with a guide. So that really encapsulates the whole flow. I know that there's a lot of information there, but that is how you can create these types of voice agents using n8n and Vapi. Thanks so much for watching. If it was helpful, please like, comment, and subscribe. And remember, a bunch of details below on how you can set this up yourself. But until next time, have a great day.